Today we're going to use this ugly little app that we've probably seen before on a couple of my other videos. We'll use it just for demonstration's sake, because today we're just going to be looking at the parts of the programming that happen behind the scenes for something like this. And we aren't only going to worry about, in this case, we'll just call it the basic standard form 1. So none of the other pieces or the C# programming that helps bolster this up, because ultimately you're going to be staying in this form 1, and form 1 is the default program that you use, and you can rename it, but you end up spending most of your time in here. So let's go take a look. And to get into it, all you have to do is click any of the elements. Right now I have the exit button active, but any one of these will take you into there. So let's take a look. And what I'm going to do is scroll straight to the top, and you're going to see all this using stuff. Now, in this case, most of this stuff, if you started a new project, should already be in there. So if you pick C# forms, you get the form, this thing called forms at the bottom. The other ones are pretty standard stuff that they're going to use with forms. Now, what are they? These essentially are libraries that help us make the form. We don't need to create things. We don't do all programming by hand. So this brings up another question or point, which is the /. These slashes, if you put 2 in a row, is what's referred to as a single line comment. And when I do that, this allows us to make notes inside of our C# program and have it not try to execute it. So when it goes to time to build, compile, etc., these lines will be totally ignored by the compiler. But let's get back to the libraries. So as you can see, you have a drawing, you have one for text. These things make it so easy for us, so we're going to be able to drag and drop stuff in from the .NET library that we won't have to do all of this stuff on our own, because even making something as simple as this, I mean, think about it. We'd have to draw out a rectangle, so we'd have to give it dimensions. Every button would have a dimension. We have to go ahead and create all this extra code that, let's face it, it's been done before, so why not go ahead and just use what people have already provided for us. Now, these libraries probably don't run on their own. These are essentially to help others. Now, let's keep going down here until we see the word namespace. And the simplest way at this point in our juncture to remember what namespace is we're going to call it a container that holds classes. That's one of its very primary functions. So when you see this curly bracket, it's going to have a ending bracket. So and you could call it bracket or brace, whatever. I like calling it brackets just because in physics, when I was a physics major, we always called this a bracket, and the first one was called a bra, and the last one was always called a cat. So we knew exactly where things ended. But this bracket, this curly brace or curly bracket, will contain everything, in this case the partial class form 1, in it. Now you can put another class in it, but in this case we only have one class in there. The only way to run this program is to have that initial namespace. Then what's a class? Well, you could think in terms of what we just said. We could say that the class is another container that can hold multiple methods. Okay, which brings up two questions. One, why do we need it? And two, what are methods? Well, I'm going to add this to it, and functions. A class will do many things, but two basic things it does is it contains lots of code, and it does it simply, and secondly, it can create objects. So in this case, we're creating a class which actually will control a bunch of objects on the form. So if you remember, we had a click me button on here. So if we go back to the designer, and I'm going to get rid of this one, because I put the blue on it, it becomes active here. This object is there, and it was created essentially by that class, and now is being controlled by that class. To truly control it, you need a method or some piece of programming. Create these little sub-bytes called methods, and every time you see something that doesn't have the word class or namespace but still has the container, and in fact if you look at the class and go all the way down, it has its own brace or bracket, and every method is going to have its own brace or bracket. And once you're inside one of those guys, this is a method. And then, which I'm going to call a group of code that is used for a specific purpose. And as we go, we're going to add more definitions to the word class, namespace, and method. But this is kind of the simplest way. Take something and break it into bite-sized pieces. Now, most codes or most programming languages originally had some type of main function, and then they call out to a method, a function, a subroutine, some type of sub-program. Just so that they could have these quantized pieces that they could use and then reuse if need be, so they wouldn't have all this redundant code, and also so that they wouldn't have the super long main function or main method. So with this method, what you can do is you can do a couple things. Well, first off, you can do a coordinated sequence of instructions. And as we write this, what you're going to notice is now this is no longer in black, or green, I should say. It's black. If you notice before, whenever we did a comment, it is in green. So anything that's green in the Visual Studio environment is going to be, and I'm hoping that's green because I'm colorblind, it might be gray, is that when you do that, that means all those lines aren't going to be red. You also see another type of color coding, which is blue, that those are essentially going to be keywords that have already been established by C#. So in other words, when you start doing your own programming and creating your own variables and stuff, you can't use the word private or void or object. It's going to get mad at you. Also, this event args you can't use. So the blue and the gray aren't going to be used. Some of these, but just remember at this point, blue and gray don't use, and green, or what I'm hoping is green, is going to be stripped out. All the black stuff can be, is essentially either generated and can be changed, or it's user generated. So what this is telling me by going black is it's going to try to execute this line. But you'll also see this squiggly line underneath, meaning if I try to run this, this is what Visual Studio is telling you. If I try to run this, it's not going to run. You're going to crash. You're going to get a compile error. In fact, if I hit the start button, it's going to say, you have errors. Would you want to run the last successful build? I'll say no, and it will tell you everything wrong that you've done. Now, in this case, my biggest mistake was just using English instead of C# syntax. The way to alleviate this is I could put another 2 forward slashes in there to turn it back into a a comment. But in this case, what I think I want to do is do a multi-line comment. So I'm going to do a /*, and I'm going to put the word multi-line comment. And notice everything goes green because everything after this now becomes a comment. So how do we end it? Well, we just do the reverse. I'm going to do // and then all of a sudden this stuff goes back to blue and black and gray. So now we have a multi-line comment, and let's keep talking about the method. The method also is usually, and this is for C# mostly, is usually associated with an object, which we talked about in terms of this, in terms of the click me. Form 1, guess what form 1 is? That is this guy. So if I click on him, form 1, and double click into him, this is where I go to. It will say, okay, what do you want that's specific to form 1? What type of programming do you want to act on form 1? So now that's the basics of programming. So in every time we get into a form, we're going to have a bunch of using statements at the top. We're going to have a namespace that contains everything else, the using statements. Then we're going to, inside that namespace, we're going to have at least one class, and inside one of that class we're going to have a bunch of methods. Almost guaranteed. And hopefully it will run. So now the last piece of this puzzle is what we're going to refer to as syntax. So in English you have punctuation. In programming languages we're going to call it a syntax, or at least that's what I'm going to that's what I'm going to call it. You could probably quibble over that a little bit. But anyways, what you're going to see first off is, let's go back to the bracket, the curly bracket. You have to use a curly bracket here. You can't use a parenthesis. So you think, well, how about if I use a square bracket? No, if you use a square bracket, as you can see from the error, it'll tell you down here, hey, I was expecting a curly bracket because it's a namespace. You have to use it. You can't use a parenthesis. It will just give you that same exact error. Until you use the curly bracket, you have to do it. That whenever you do a curly bracket, the default will draw another curly bracket. You can undo this in your preferences, but actually I tend to like it, because then I always have a beginning and an end. And as you can see, you build up a lot of these brackets after a while, the curly brackets. So sometimes you can't exactly see which curly bracket, which beginning curly brace is combined with an ending curly brace, especially if you skip one, because it won't give you this nice little indented section. Indenting is great because then it can tell you where you are. So in other words, I know I'm at the namespace level if I'm in here. So if I were to write something right here like hello, what I'd want to do is put it in here, because it's not contained by the method. In fact, I wouldn't say that's right either. I'd want it over here. But it is contained by the class. So that can tell you where you are in terms of what container you're in. And I would suggest that you use this for any programming languages. Visual Studio will naturally indent for you unless it doesn't quite know what's going on, and then you know you have a problem. But if you're using any type of other editor, I'd say always make sure you indent. Your fellow programmers, if you're going to work with someone, will love you. You'll love yourself, a year from now when you go back and look at your code too. And the same thing for comments. Comments are always a good thing. I don't know how many times I've gone back into one of my programs and said, what the heck was I doing here? if I don't have comments telling me what I did. You would think you'd remember all this stuff, but you never do. Especially the longer the program is, the more you need comments, and the more likely you're going to forget what type of logic you were using at the time. So both of those are well suited. But let's get back to syntax. So I always call the brackets containers for the paragraph, because in every paragraph in English you always indent, right, the first part, or hopefully you do, and then you don't finish the line at the end of the paragraph, right? So you actually have a specific formatting for how you do a paragraph in a book or in an essay or whatever. The same thing goes for this here. We have to have the end and the beginning, but it can contain many lines. So in this case, I would call this a one-sentence paragraph. Down here, I'd call this a two-sentence paragraph. Down here, well, I guess we don't have anything too long. If you want to count comments, then you got a 5-line paragraph. So try to think of the containers as kind of paragraphs, and I know you're kind of putting paragraphs within paragraphs when you talk about namespaces and classes, but when you talk about methods, that is a paragraph. And so if that's a paragraph, then what declares a sentence? So at the end of a sentence, you're going to have a period, a question mark, an exclamation point, something like that in English. In programming, what we want is the semicolon. So everything's going to end in a semicolon that is not, or excuse me, that is within the container, almost always. Now, you're going to look at this right away and say, well, I see this line, it doesn't have a semicolon, and this line doesn't have a semicolon. Same for the class and the same for the namespace. Well, those are special. Since those are containers, these are essentially like labels for the containers, and we'll talk about these later a little bit more in depth. But this is a label saying that I have a paragraph named Form1 load, if you want to think of it that way. And then you actually write the paragraph. So this is specific and will never take a semicolon. Same for this. This is a class that I'm going to call Form1. This is a namespace that I'm going to call First Project. And if you look at the word First Project there, I don't know if you picked this up, this is also going to be the name of your solution file. So 9 times out of 10, you're going to have to use a semicolon. We'll practice this as we go along, but generally, whenever you say something inside a curly bracket, and it's not a label, like I said, and I know that's not really computer speak, that this isn't technically a label, this is a header. We'll talk about that later. When you use a header or label, it does not need to have a semicolon. In fact, it shouldn't have a semicolon. Semicolons are for executable lines only. Okay, if you've never heard this stuff before, that's probably a lot to soak in. So let's let that soak in, and then I'm going to come back and make another video and talk about the specifics of those buttons that we just looked at in the form.